According to the great person Sorensen and Toffing in 2007, they had spoken about the proliferation of relatively independent private and public organization, the managerial activities that are going to go forward in terms of corporate governance would involve complex decision-making skills. Now, when you look here, there is a coordination mechanism which comes in two forms, one with the markets and the other one with the hierarchies. Good morning and welcome to the Session 2, Chapter 3, Unit 1, 4th Semester BBA, Good Governance in India, where we are going to talk about networking and collaborative governance. Whenever we talk about this governance factor, the most interesting thing that you need to note is the growing partnership between the organization, between the governments and the society, which is actually bringing in a global system or a setup where people are able to get into higher complexity and dynamics. Now, what do I mean by this inter-networking is all about where all the government bodies, institutions, public as well as private organizations are joining hands together in order to create a collaborative experience of running the system, running the government altogether. Now, when you go through here, you will be able to understand that according to the great person Sorensen and Toffing in 2007, they had spoken about the proliferation of relatively independent private and public organizations who seek to represent multiple actors and try to understand their different identities. What do we mean by this? We understand that in a society, there are a lot of public as well as private entities that exist. Each one of them stand for a particular purpose. Each one of them have a different form. They have a different belief, and they also have a different setup in terms of representing the society. So what brings in here is that the reasoning, the procedures that they follow in terms of letting the corporate governance come inside is the main part of the discussion. Now, these aspects lead to a greater interaction. Why do they lead to a greater interaction? Because when you see organizations trying to talk about the purpose, their existence, how they have come up, the other organizations are equally interested in terms of knowing it, in terms of building the future, in terms of understanding how things are changing altogether. So that's why I would always say that the organizational setup is very, very important when we are trying to understand the entire nature, the entire work order altogether. Sometimes down the lane, we would see that every organization would try to bring in some expertise, will try to bring in some value across the table, which will be shared among other organizations so that it will form a collaborative experience in terms of building up a better corporate governance. Now, moving further, whenever we talk about this collaborative governance, it refers to a set of tools that makes it possible to coordinate the actors involved in network. It's also known as a bargaining process, how the organization will participate in the network, how they will share the best practices, how they will communicate with each other, and how they will achieve a collective process in the long run. It also includes a lot of decision making and control process, which makes it possible to implement a setup. Now, for example, let's take Google. When they took up the initiative or a partnership with the Indian Railways in order to set up the Wi-Fi system in the public railway stations altogether. The initiative was done for two purposes. One side, with the growth of digital platforms growing everywhere and the need for internet growing everywhere, people wanted Wi-Fi facility to be made a mandatory show-cause use everywhere. So that's why you saw that Google came into picture and Google started putting in that Wi-Fi systems across every railway station. But at the same time, the railways also understood that when they were partnering with a private organization like Google, what they wanted is they also wanted to place in certain control systems. They wanted certain monitoring. They wanted certain security cameras and things in place where you would see that the collaboration of involving multiple players into action requires some protocols, requires some sort of beliefs, values to be in place so that there is an influence in the society of understanding how people interact, how people react, how do they go about in terms of sharing the common values. Followed by the set of formal or informal factors that we are talking about, procedures that develops over time through a process of incremental learning as the actors tend to revise their perception of the problem, their identities, and also the very structure of governance. Which means to say that, in other words, if I have to make it very, very simple, according to the surrounding context, that is according to the environment, according to the situation, the players as well as the organizations will try to change their governance model. Now, you cannot have one governance model across India, across every platform, and keep talking about the same going forward that, this model will work in every state and every district. So what happens here is that the perceptions of a particular place, a particular zone will vary from the other thing. So every player, every institution who is planning to get into a network-based corporate governance model has to understand the local problems, the local issues, where the challenges are, how these challenges can be addressed, and how we can take it forward. So in that sense, I would say that the surrounding context is very, very important when we are talking about the collaborative government experience. This is highly important for all of us to understand in the modern context. Followed by, whenever we are talking about this network base, we also talk about the relative autonomous positions and the strategies of the actors, which includes in the complexity of the decision-making process. Now, why this is coming into picture? One side, when you are talking about collaboration, but the other side, we also need to know, in any form of governance, people would try to seek independence. People would try to seek their own space and identity, which means to say that even in the decision-making process, organizations as well as the players would tend to seek their own decision, would tend to make it in the way they want it, which means there might be a complexity that will land up in terms of decision making. So it's very important for all of us to understand the managerial activities that are going to go forward in terms of corporate governance would involve complex decision-making skills, because there are multiple stakeholders, there are multiple players who come into picture. So each one of them will come back and say what are the pros and cons of taking a particular decision. So in that sense, what happens here is that there is a conceptual clarity that is required, and at every juncture, that networking of understanding how it is going forward, why we need to do it in this way, what are the kind of strategies that are essential, and will this networking work for all those factors have to be understood and clearly portrayed in such a manner so that everybody is able to go forward with the need. There is also one thing where you need to see here, when we are talking about the governing factor here, the extensive networking is mainly required. Why? Because every point you need to understand that not everyone is an expert and not everyone knows everything about the environment. So we need to start networking with the local factors, the players, that is the officials and the governmental bodies. Try to understand what can be the best and then adapt the conceptual clarity there. Now, we cannot just go with a theoristic belief to it. Now, let's say for an example, I want to do a corporate governance network in the northeastern states of India. Though I am from India, but I might not be really popular enough or known factor in terms of understanding the tradition, the culture that is going on in the eastern parts of India. So my primary aim here would be is to understand that cultural values, to understand the localization by actively employing my network, trying to find out who can be the local contacts, what are the good, what is the bad, how to build in the pros and cons of that networking, and then install the corporate governance model altogether. Followed by the trust in the governance factor. This is a very, very core and important factor, and it can be contrasted with two forms of governance. One is the markets and the other one is the hierarchies. Now, trust is a coordination mechanism that we need to understand clearly. Now, when you are joining hands together, you need to trust the other person and you need to give that equal importance because they are also a part of this network. Now, when you look here, there is a coordination mechanism which comes in two forms, one with the markets and the other one with the hierarchies. There is a traditional methodology and one with the current situation altogether. So within the network, what happens here is that coordination by hierarchy and market is necessarily not absent. Why? Because you would see that one side we are trying to pitch in the traditional factors. The other side, we are trying to pitch in something that the market needs. So the collaboration between the market and the hierarchy, the necessity factors, what we are trying to say, will require a core understanding, a deeper understanding of the network. Now, for example, if I have to get into the state of Maharashtra to understand about the deeper perspectives in terms of how to bring in governance towards women empowerment or employment, it's not that easy. Why? Because I need to know the local language. I need to know how the markets respond to that situation. Plus, I also need to understand the hierarchy that has been set up in each district of Maharashtra. So what happens here is that when I collaborate with the local bodies there, I try to understand what mechanism would be the best way and how should I first build trust among the people there so that they are able to embrace my ideas and take it forward. Followed by governance and the meta governance. Now, this is very, very important. Why? Because the concept of networking is based on the meta governance. Now, we are all connected by governance. Yeah, that we all know. Why? Because that started emerging about in the late 1990s. In the context of network theory, the policy of networks and the network management, we also talk about the meta governance network. Why? Because this is the network of networks. So when you compare your governance model with multiple players, with multiple governments, states, districts, and the officials getting involved into it, you will be able to see that the policy of network is like a cluster which is made of lot of factors. Every factor has its own dependency. Every factor has its own factor that comes into it, understanding. So you get completely into a cluster-based model. Followed by the governance of innovation. Now, we have also seen that of late there has been a significant amount of improvement that has come in terms of innovation into the corporate governance network. There are various new needs and wants that have to be addressed when you're talking about corporate governance. And we are not just talking about the factor of transparency and accountability anymore, but we are also talking about the factor of effectiveness, approach. We are also talking about innovation. We are also talking about the legitimacy. We're looking into factors that sustainability, all these things are probably the new challenges that have been brought into the system of collaborative governance altogether. So with all this, gaining attention and traction everywhere, I think the concept of corporate governance is becoming a complex subject for each one of us to understand. And this is not going to be an easy thing for us, as we need to realize and we need to take it forward. Now, the conclusion for this particular session would be on the factor that one development might be foreseen as a growing specialization, network theory. Though the generic concepts will be applied, the traditional hierarchy of corporate governance will still continue to be an enthusiastic factor for us, and we will be intertwined by the questions and theories that are going to pop up everywhere. But nevertheless, what is the concept that we are trying to understand is that we're not going to give up on the old concept. Rather, we are going to spend time in terms of combining our idea with the modern innovation so that you are able to answer the challenges for today. So in this way, the conclusion for this entire thing would be more on the network-based theory, combining the multiple forces, combining technology, process, people, everybody in a different, in a common platform altogether, and trying to make the best use of corporate governance. Now, the other factor that we need to also understand, even the public administration scholars have taken the governance network theory and they have built specific topics using this governance theory where they have felt that the citizen participation, or when we're talking about management in terms of process, the accountability, risk factors, all of them have been revisited with better ideas and thought process so that networking in corporate governance becomes fruitful. With this, I come to the end of today's session. I hope and believe that all the facts and figures that have been spoken through this particular session will be of a great help to you, both in terms of theory as well as in the practical walk of life. In the upcoming session, I would be discussing more about the various factors of the Public Sector Act, the citizenship rights, the right to information, and other factors of governance. But until then, stay tuned, stay blessed, and stay enlightened forever. Thank you once again for joining me today on this wonderful session.